So, you see, pursued Nikolay Levin, painfully wrinkling his forehead and twitching, it was obviously difficult for him to think of what to say and do. Here, do you see? He pointed to some sort of iron bars, fastened together with strings, lying in the corner of the room. Do you see that? That's the beginning of a new thing we're going into. It's a productive association. Constantine scarcely heard him. He looked into his sickly, consumptive face, and he was more and more sorry for him, and he could not force himself to listen to what his brother was telling him about the association. He saw that this association was a mere anchor to save himself from self-contempt. Nikolay Levin went on talking. You know that capital oppresses the laborer. The laborers with us, the peasants, bear all the burden of labor and are so placed that, however much they work, they can't escape from their position of beasts of burden. All the profits of labor, on which they might improve their position and gain leisure for themselves, and after that education, all the surplus values are taken from them by the capitalists, in societies so constituted that the harder they work, the greater the profit of the merchants and the landowners, while they stay beasts of burden to the end. And that state of things must be changed, he finished, and he looked questioningly at his brother. Yes, of course, said Constantine, looking at the patch of red that had come out on his brother's projecting cheekbones. And so we're founding a locksmiths' association, where all the production and profit and the chief instruments of production will be in common. Where is the association to be? Asked Constantine Levin. In the village of Vozdrem, Kazan government. But why in a village? In the villages, I think, there is plenty of work as it is. Why a locksmiths' association in a village? Why? Because the peasants, they are just as much slaves as they ever were, and that's why you and Sergei Ivanovitch don't like people to try and get them out of their slavery, said Nikolay Levin, exasperated by the objection. Constantine Levin sighed, looking meanwhile about the cheerless and dirty room. The sigh seemed to exasperate Nikolay even more. I know your and Sergei Ivanovitch's aristocratic views. I know that he applies all the power of his intellect to justify existing evils. No. And what do you talk of Sergei Ivanovitch for? Said Levin, smiling. Sergei Ivanovitch? I'll tell you what for. Nikolay Levin shrieked suddenly at the name of Sergei Ivanovitch. I'll tell you what for. But what's the use of talking? There's only one thing. What did you come to me for? You look down on this, and you're welcome to it. Go away. In God's name, go away, he shrieked, getting up from his chair. Go away, and go away. I don't look down on it at all, said Constantine Levin timidly. I don't even dispute it. At that instant, Marya Nikolaevna came back. Nikolay Levin looked around angrily at her. She went quickly to him and whispered something. I'm not well. I've grown irritable, said Nikolay Levin, getting calmer and breathing painfully. And then you talk to me of Sergei Ivanovitch and his article. It's such rubbish, such lying, such self-deception. What can a man write of justice who knows nothing of it? Have you read his article? He asked Kritsky, sitting down again at the table and moving scattered cigarettes so as to clear a space. I've not read it, Kritsky responded gloomily, obviously not desiring to enter into the conversation. And why not? Said Nikolay Levin, now turning with exasperation upon Kritsky. Because I didn't see the use of wasting my time on it. Oh, but excuse me, how did you know it would be wasting your time? That article's too deep for many people. That's to say, it's over their head. But with me it's another thing. I see through his ideas, and I know where its weakness lies. Everyone was silent. Kritsky got up deliberately and reached for his cap. Won't you have supper? All right, goodbye. Come round tomorrow with the locksmith. Kritsky had hardly gone out when Nikolay Levin smiled and winked. He's no good either, he said. I see, of course. But at that instant, Kritsky at the door called him. What do you want now? He said, and he went out to him in the passage. Left alone with Marya Nikolaevna, Levin turned to her. Have you been long with my brother? He said to her. Yes, more than a year. Nikolay Dmitrievitch's health has become very poor. Nikolay Dmitrievitch drinks a great deal, she said. That is, how does he drink? He drinks vodka, and it's bad for him. A great deal? Whispered Levin. Yes, she said, looking timidly towards the doorway where Nikolay Levin had reappeared. What were you talking about? He said, knitting his brows and turning his scared eyes from one to the other. What was it? Oh, nothing, Konstantin answered in confusion. Oh, if you don't want to say, don't. Only it's no good your talking to her. She's a wench and you're a gentleman, he said with a jerk of the neck. You understand everything I see, and you've taken stock of everything, and look with commiseration on my shortcomings, he began again, raising his voice. Nikolay, Nikolay, whispered Marya Nikolaevna, again going to him. Oh, very well, very well. But where's supper? Oh, here it is, he said, seeing a waiter with the tray. Here, set it here, he added angrily, and promptly seizing the vodka, he poured out a glassful and drank it greedily. Like a drink? He turned to his brother, and at once he became better humored. Well, enough of Sergei Ivanovitch. I'm glad to see you, anyway. After all said and done, we're not strangers. Come, have a drink. Tell me what you're doing, he went on, greedily munching a piece of bread and pouring out another glassful. How are you living? I live alone in the country, as I used to. I'm busy looking after the land, answered Konstantin, watching with horror the greediness with which his brother ate and drank, and trying to conceal that he noticed it. Why don't you get married? It hasn't happened so, Konstantin answered, reddening a little. Why not? For me now, everything's at an end. I've made a mess of my life. But this I've said, and I say still, that if my share had been given me when I needed it, my whole life would have been different. Konstantin made haste to change the conversation. Do you know your little Vanya's with me, a clerk in the counting house? Nikolay jerked his neck and sank into thought. Yes, tell me, what's going on there? Is the house still standing? And the birch trees? And our schoolroom? And Philip the gardener, is he living? How I remember the arbor and the seat. Now mind, and don't alter anything in the house, but make haste and get married, and make everything as it used to be again. Then I'll come and see you, if your wife is nice. Come to me now, said Levin. how nicely we could arrange it. I'd come and see you if I were sure I should not find Sergei Ivanovitch. You wouldn't find him there. I live quite independently of him. Yes, but say what you like. You will have to choose between me and him, he said, looking timidly into his brother's face. This timidity touched Konstantin. If you want to hear my confession of faith on the subject, I tell you that in your quarrel with Sergei Ivanovitch, I take neither side. You are both wrong. You are more wrong externally, and he inwardly. Aha! You see that! You see that! Nikolay shouted joyfully. But I personally value friendly relations with you more because... Why? Konstantin could not say that he valued it more because Nikolay was unhappy and needed affection, but Nikolay knew that this was just what he meant to say, and scowling, he took up the vodka again. Enough, Nikolay Dmitrievich, said Marya, stretching out her plump bare arm towards the decanter. Let it be. Don't insist or I'll beat you, he shouted. Marya Nikolaevna smiled a sweet and good-humored smile, which was at once reflected on Nikolay's face, and she took the bottle. And do you suppose she understands nothing? Said Nikolay. She understands it all better than any of us. Isn't it true there's something good and sweet in her? Were you never before in Moscow? Konstantin said to her, for the sake of saying something. Only you mustn't be polite and stiff with her. It frightens her. No one ever spoke to her so, but the justices of the peace who tried to get her for trying to get out of a house of ill fame. Mercy on us, the senselessness in the world, he cried suddenly. These new institutions, these justices of the peace, rural councils, what hideousness it all is. And he began to enlarge on his encounters with the new institutions. Konstantin Levin heard him, and the disbelief in the sense of all public institutions, which he shared with him and often expressed, was distasteful to him now from his brother's lips. In another world we shall understand it all, he said lightly. In another world? Oh, I don't like that other world. I don't like it, he said, letting his scared eyes rest on his brother's eyes. Here one would think that to get out of all the baseness and the mess, one's own and other people's, would be a good thing, and yet I'm afraid of death. I'm awfully afraid of death. He shuddered. But do drink something. Would you like some champagne? Or shall we go somewhere? Let's go to the gypsies. Do you know I have got so fond of the gypsies and Russian songs. His speech had begun to falter, and he passed abruptly from one subject to another. Konstantin, with the help of Masha, persuaded him not to go out anywhere, and got him to bed, hopelessly drunk. Masha promised to write to Konstantin in case of need, and to persuade Nikolay Levin to go and stay with his brother. In the morning, Konstantin Levin left Moscow, and towards evening he reached home. On the journey in the train, he talked to his neighbors about politics and the new railways, and just as in Moscow, he was overcome by a sense of confusion of ideas, dissatisfaction with himself, shame of something or other. But when he got out at his own station, when he saw his one-eyed coachman, Ignat, with the collar of his coat turned up, when, in the dim light reflected by the station fires, he saw his own sledge, his own horses with their tails tied up, and their harness trimmed with rings and tassels, when the coachman, Ignat, as he put in his luggage, told him the village news, that the contractor had arrived, and that Baba had calved. He felt that, little by little, the confusion was clearing up, and the shame and self-dissatisfaction were passing away. He felt this at the mere sight of Ignat and the horses, but when he had put on the sheepskin brought for him, had sat down wrapped up in the sledge, and had driven off pondering on the work that lay before him in the village, and, staring at the side-horse that had been his saddle-horse, past his prime now, but a spirited beast from the dawn, he began to see what had happened to him in quite a different light. He felt himself, and he did not want to be anyone else. All he wanted now was to be better than before. In the first place, he resolved that from that day he would give up hoping for any extraordinary happiness, such as marriage must have given him, and consequently he would not so disdain what he really had. Secondly, he would never again let himself give way to low passion, the memory of which had so tortured him when he had been making up his mind to make an offer. Then, remembering his brother Nikolay, he resolved to himself that he would never allow himself to forget him, that he would follow him up and not lose sight of him, so as to be ready to help when things should go ill with him. And that would be soon, he felt. Then, too, his brother's talk of communism, which he had treated so lightly at the time, now made him think. He considered a revolution in economic conditions nonsense. But he always felt the injustice of his own abundance in comparison with the poverty of the peasants, and now he determined that, so as to feel quite in the right, though he had worked hard and lived by no means luxuriously before, he would now work still harder, and would allow himself even less luxury. And all this seemed to him so easy a conquest over himself that he spent the whole drive in the pleasantest daydream. With a resolute feeling of hope in a new, better life, he reached home before 9 o'clock at night. The snow of the little quadrangle before the house was lit up by a light in the bedroom window of his old nurse, Agafea Mihailovna, who performed the duties of housekeeping in his house. She was not yet asleep. Kuzma, waked by her, came sidling sleepily out onto the steps. A setter, Laska, ran out too, almost upsetting Kuzma, and whining turned round and round about Levin's knees, jumping up and longing, but not daring, to put his forepaws on his master's chest. "You're soon back again, sir," said Agafea. "I got tired of it, Agafea. With friends, one is well, but at home, one is better," he answered, and he went into his study. The study was slowly lit up as the candle was brought in. The familiar details came out: the staghorns, the bookshelves, the looking-glass, the stove with its ventilator, which had long wanted mending, his father's sofa, a large table, on the table an open book, a broken ashtray, a manuscript book with his handwriting. As he saw all this, there came over him for an instant a doubt of the possibility of arranging the new life of which he had been dreaming on the road. All these traces of his life seemed to clutch him, and to say to him, "No, you're not going to get away from us, and you're not going to be different, but you're going to be the same as you've always been, with doubts, everlasting dissatisfaction with yourself, vain efforts to amend, and falls, and everlasting expectation of a happiness which you won't get and which isn't possible for you." This the things said to him, but another voice in his heart was telling him that he must not fall under the sway of the past, and that one can do anything with oneself. and hearing that voice, he went into the corner where stood his 2 heavy dumbbells and began brandishing them like a gymnast, trying to restore his confident temper. There was a creak of steps at the door. He hastily put down the dumbbells. The bailiff came in and said everything, thank God, was doing well, but informed him that the buckwheat in the new drying machine had been a little scorched. This piece of news irritated Levin. The new drying machine had been constructed and partly invented by Levin. The bailiff had always been against the drying machine, and now it was with suppressed triumph that he announced that the buckwheat had been scorched. Levin was so firmly convinced that if the buckwheat had been scorched, it was only because precautions had not been taken, for which he had hundreds of times given orders. He was annoyed, and he reprimanded the bailiff. But there had been an important and joyful event. Pava, his best cow, an expensive beast, bought at a show, had calved. "Kowsma, give me my sheepskin, and you tell them to take a lantern. I'll come and look at her," he said to the bailiff. The cow-house for the more valuable cows was just behind the house. Walking across the yard, passing a snowdrift by the lilac tree, he went into the cow-house. There was the warm, steamy smell of dung when the frozen door was opened, and the cows, astonished at the unfamiliar light of the lantern, stirred on the fresh straw. He caught a glimpse of the broad, smooth, black, and piebald back of Halanga. Berkut, the bull, was lying down with his ring in his lip, and seemed about to get up, but thought better of it, and only gave 2 snorts as they passed by him. Pava, a perfect beauty, huge as a hippopotamus, with her back turned them, prevented their seeing the calf as she sniffed her all over. Levin went into the pen, looked Pava over, and lifted the red and spotted calf onto her long, tottering legs. Pava, uneasy, began lowing, but when Levin put the calf close to her, she was soothed, and sighing heavily, began licking her with her rough tongue. The calf, fumbling, poked her nose under her mother's udder and stiffened her tail out straight. "Here, bring the light, Fyodor, this way," said Levin, examining the calf. "Like the mother, though the color takes after the father, but that's nothing. Very good, long and broad in the haunch. Vasily Fedorovitch, isn't she splendid?" he said to the bailiff. "And how could she fail to be?" "Oh, yes, Semyon, the contractor, came the day after you left, I think. You must settle with him, Konstantin Dmitrovitch," said the bailiff. "I did inform you about the machine." This question was enough to take Levin back to the details of his work on the estate, which was on a large scale and complicated. He went straight from the cow-house to the counting-house, and after a little conversation with the bailiff and Semyon the contractor, he went back to the house and straight upstairs to the drawing-room. The house was big and old-fashioned, and Levin, though he lived alone, had the whole house heated and used. He knew that this was stupid. He knew that it was positively not right, and contrary to his present new plans. But this house was a whole world to Levin. It was the world in which his father and mother had lived and died. They had lived just the life that to Levin seemed to be the ideal of perfection, and that he dreamed of beginning with his wife, his family. Levin scarcely remembered his mother. His conception of her was for him a sacred memory, and his future wife was bound to be in his imagination a repetition of that exquisite, holy ideal of a woman that his mother had been. He was so far from conceiving of love for woman apart from marriage that he positively pictured to himself first the family, and only secondarily the woman who would give him a family. His ideas of marriage were consequently, quite unlike those of the great majority of his acquaintances, for whom getting married was one of the numerous facts of social life. For Levin it was the chief affair of life, on which its whole happiness turned, and now he had to give up that. When he had gone into the little drawing-room, where he always had tea, and had settled himself in his armchair with a book, and Agafea Mihalovna had brought him tea, and with her usual, "Well, I'll stay a while, sir," had taken a chair in the window, he felt that, however strange it might be, he had not parted from his daydreams, and that he could not live without them. Whether with her or with another, still it would be. He was reading a book, and thinking of what he was reading, stopping to listen to Agafea Mihalovna, who gossiped away without flagging, and yet with all that, all sorts of pictures of family life and work in the future rose disconnectedly before his imagination. He felt that in the depth of his soul something had been put in its place, settled down, and laid to rest. He heard Agafea Mihalovna talking of how Prohor had forgotten his duty to God, and with the money Levin had given him to buy a house, had been drinking without stop, and had beaten his wife till he had half killed her. He listened and read his book, and recalled the whole train of ideas suggested by his reading. It was Tyndale's Treatise on Heat. He recalled his own criticisms of Tyndale, of his complacent satisfaction in the cleverness of his experiments, and for his lack of philosophic insight. And suddenly there floated into his mind the joyful thought, "In 2 years' time I shall have 2 Dutch cows. Pava herself will perhaps still be alive, a dozen young daughters of Berkut, and the 3 others. How lovely!" He took up his book again. "Very good. Electricity and heat are the same thing. But is it possible to substitute the one quantity for the other in the equation for the solution of the problem? No. Well, then, what of it? The connection between all the forces of nature is felt instinctively. It's particularly nice if Pava's daughter should be a red-spotted cow, and all the herd will take after her, and the other 3 too. Splendid. To go out with my wife and visitors to meet the herd. My wife says, Kostya and I looked after that calf like a child. How can it interest you so much? Says a visitor. Everything that interests him interests me. But who will she be? And he remembered now what had happened at Moscow. Well, there's nothing to be done. But now everything shall go on in a new way. It's nonsense to pretend that life won't let one, that the past won't let one. One must struggle to live better, much better. He raised his head and fell to dreaming. Old Laska, who had not yet fully digested her delight at his return, and had run out into the yard to bark, came back wagging her tail, and crept up to him, bringing in the scent of fresh air, put her head under his hand, and whined plaintively, asking to be stroked. "There, who would have thought it?" said Agafea Mihalovna. "The dog now. Why, she understands that her master's come home, and that he's low-spirited." "Why low-spirited?" "Do you suppose I don't see it, sir? It's high time I should know the gentry. Why, I've grown up from a little thing with them. It's nothing, sir, so long as there's health and a clear conscience." Levin looked intently at her, surprised at how well she knew his thought. "Shall I fetch you another cup?" said she, and taking his cup, she went out. Laska kept poking her head under his hand. He stroked her, and she promptly curled up at his feet, laying her head on a hind paw. and in token of all now being well and satisfactory, she opened her mouth a little, smacked her lips, and settling her sticky lips more comfortably about her old teeth, she sank into blissful repose. Levin watched all her movements attentively. "That's what I'll do," he said to himself. "That's what I'll do. Nothing is amiss. All is well."